Now, um, Chandru has commented very kindly on my earlier effort to present some of these ideas, but I think it is very important for us to recognize that we have in this world, particularly on the part of not of people who deal with monetary policy, but beyond that, we have a fetish with inflation. And this has become very clear over the last 3 decades. I want to emphasize, for example, that something which is almost standard for over 3 decades, the whole idea of inflation targeting, was completely arbitrary. It was decided it was set, the 2% inflation target was set by the New Zealand finance minister on a whim because it sounded good. You know, it sounded good as an election slogan. And this was the origins of it. And the whole world now takes this 2% inflation targeting experience. And to my great disappointment, I remember about 2 decades ago, the Central Bank of Malaysia was celebrating its half centenary and invited Joseph Stiglitz to speak. He rubbished a lot of this fetish with inflation targeting. But to my great surprise, the governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa, who's now the finance minister of South Africa, explicitly criticized Stiglitz for criticizing one of the most important innovations in monetary policy. So unfortunately, although there is some problem with this, for example, and some perverse problems, for example, the Bank of Japan struggling to achieve 2% inflation, you know, and we have now a consensus. And it's very interesting to look at what the Japanese governor of the Bank of Japan has been doing in explicitly rejecting the whole idea of raising interest rates together with the rest of the world. I think it's very important for us to recognize that. Now, the ability of Japan to successfully be able to do that is, of course, contingent on a variety of factors which we need to pay attention to. But let us recognize that we have had a situation of what I would call fiscal populism, where governments have been quietly borrowing, and the scope of fiscal policy has actually been shrinking. So much less government spending, much less of dirigism, if you will, and much more emphasis on government deficits and the ability and paying lip service to these government deficits as a major constraint to the ability. An unwillingness to tax the rich, and an unwillingness and of course an inability to tax the poor. So we have a very important situation where the trend in much of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa, has been that fiscal systems have actually become much more regressive. Regressive in two respects. On the one hand, the collection of revenue, of taxes, is less and less progressive because of the shift from direct taxation, income taxation, to much more much more indirect taxation, consumption taxes, whether it's VAT or GST or whatever you want to call it. And this has been a very important phenomenon in much of the world. So I think it's very important for us to think very carefully about where these ideas come from and to demystify this. It is important for us to demystify it in our different contexts. And of course, very often there are specific arguments to be deployed in specific contexts. one size does not fit all, but nonetheless, I think it is very important. So this identification of what is called stabilization, and I would commend an earlier book by Prabhat Patnaik about 2 decades ago, which deals with questions with many macroeconomic issues, but specifically on the question of stabilization. Since the 1980s, as we know, in Latin America and in Africa, the whole question of stabilization has been defined and equated with the suppression of inflation. Okay, and so this considerably reduces the scope for government intervention, which and is also associated with the greater regressiveness of the fiscal impact. So I think we need to recognize that, in fact, even mainstream neoliberal organizations such as the World Bank have actually done research which shows that inflation, moderate inflation, is not a threat. It becomes problematic when you have a tendency to accelerate, for the inflation to accelerate and to achieve what might be called hyperinflation, and it's the accelerating element which is problematic. And this research was done by people like Bruno, the late Michael Bruno, who was at that time chief economist at the bank, and William Easterly, who is said to be an expert on Africa. He's very, very explicit. He's the counterpoint in the American development discourse against Jeffrey Sachs. But basically, both of them are problematic for a variety of different reasons, which I don't have time to get into. So I think it's very important for us not to be influenced by this discourse and to take very, very seriously some of the issues, the longer term issues which were highlighted in Prabhat Patnaik's opening remarks. Now, a second point, I think, which is I'd like to make is about the situation which I fear is happening in the world, that we are going to stumble into stagflation. The tendency, of course, when we talk about stagflation, is to think about the previous episode of stagflation in the West in the second half of the 1970s, when it was considered to be important, particularly in the Anglophone West. And it's important for us to recognize that what we have are a variety of factors which are coming together to contribute to this situation. So we have a double-edged. It's important for us to recognize also that the globalization, which many people talk about, but often it's like the proverbial Indian elephant, where people are referring to different parts of the elephant when they talk. It's very important for us to recognize that so-called trade liberalization has actually largely ended about at the turn of the century. There's very little significant trade liberalization to speak of since the turn of the century. And it is the West which is actually blocking trade liberalization. Okay, if you think about the responses to the global financial crisis of 2008, it was the West, rich countries, who basically introduced all kinds of new trade barriers, ostensibly to protect themselves. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that that kind of globalization is over. That's why you hardly hear the champions of trade liberalization speaking anymore, the ones in the West. But nonetheless, what the phenomenon of financial globalization continues to grow. And I think it is important for us to recognize that financial globalization has very different ramifications in different parts of the world. One, financial globalization combined with quantitative easing, for example, in the United States resulted in a phenomenon which people like Bill Lazonic and Shin Jang-suk referred to, which accelerated the process of wealth concentration in the United States in particular ways. But in Europe and elsewhere, the consequences were, of course, quite different. So we need to begin to recognize that this unconventional monetary policies, quantitative easing, and so on and so forth, that era is largely over now. It has been the counter to that has been led, of course, by Jerome Powell. But I would argue that the intellectual antecedent to that was, of course, Larry Summers, who took the ideas of Alvin Hansen from the 1930s and gave it a particular twist and deployed it to talk about so-called secular stagnation in ways which have contributed to this U-turn in public policy. So it's now so the but many of the recent phenomena are actually explicitly political. If we think, for example, about Obama's pivot to Asia, well, offered by people like Hillary Clinton from about a decade ago. The pivot to Asia was basically to shift the attention to basically to launch the new Cold War in a particular way. And then more recently, of course, you have the kind of what I call ethno-populism, bordering on neo-fascism, if you will, of people like Trump and Abe, and calling for reshoring, asking their corporations to get out of China, especially, and come back. Now, for us in Southeast Asia, who are quite integrated from a trade point of view, with the so-called global supply networks and value chains and so on with China, this has become quite devastating because so much of Southeast Asia is integrated with China. And this has become problematic. But for many countries in the world, the developing world, China is now the major trading partner. So the effects of this are far greater than Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia probably much more vulnerable. But elsewhere as well, I think we have a very, very important problem.
5 minutes.
And then, of course, you have the more recent problems with COVID-19 and war and sanctions and so on, which have further increased disruptions on the supply side. And I think it's very important to recognize that the current inflation are really due to supply side disruptions, rather than what elementary types of teaching of economics calls demand pull. So the raising interest rates is not going to address the supply side disruptions. It's not going to address these problems. And I think this is very important for us to recognize because you can raise interest. And this is Governor Kuroda of the Bank of Japan has made this quite explicit. Now, since I'm running out of time, let me move on to point out that there is a big difference between what Paul Volcker did in 1980 when he raised interest rates very, very high. It killed inflation, undoubtedly, but it also killed growth. And Latin America had a decade of so-called the lost decade, and Africa had a lost quarter century. Okay, and I think it's only somewhere from the beginning of this century that Africa begins to start picking up again. So I won't go through much of what has happened in as far as Russia and Ukraine is concerned, except to emphasize that the war is disruptive, undoubtedly, the war in the Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also even more disruptive, I would argue, have been sanctions. And it reminds us of all the trade disruptions. So the very people who talk so much about trade liberalization are all undertaking illegal sanctions, because none of these sanctions which we're talking about, okay, are actually endorsed by the United Nations. Okay, the UN Security Council has never endorsed the sanctions which are unilaterally being imposed by NATO. So we need to begin to recognize that the relationship that even in a very traditional sense, the economy is very political. And what is happening in terms of economic relations is very important, very, very political. And also very importantly, I think in this regard, is to recognize that they really don't care. Okay, I mean, they were very concerned about the disruption of energy supplies uh, for Europe, but they didn't care that there was not going to be enough wheat for Africa and West Asian countries. They didn't care that there was not going to be enough fertilizer for farmers. And we all know the disastrous if when the Sri Lankan government, the last Sri Lankan government ran out of foreign exchange, it said, "Oh, we are going to go organic. Agriculture is going to go organic," and that made the problem even more serious. So we need to begin to think and challenge all these policies which are being undertaken right in front of us, and think through some of the consequences. So we have a very explicit hit on food security, not only in the short term, war related, but also in the medium term, fertilizer related. And we need to think about some of these things. Now, there are many other things that we can say about how property rights have been violated, how you just take over the properties of Venezuela and Argentina, and Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. But all this reminds us that in a very brazen way, imperialism is alive and well. Now, the last slide I have here reminds us that, in fact, the need for the fiscal effort actually yields tremendous amount of revenue. And a study for OECD economies suggests that the revenue collected, the additional revenue collected made possible through a strong fiscal effort is 4 times, okay, is 4 times the cost of that fiscal effort. Okay. Now, one might well argue, and I think it is true, many developing countries, unfortunately, are not in a situation where their economies are coherent enough to be able to deal with this effectively. But I think it's very important for us I mean, that you might not have an increase in revenue of 4 times because of the nature of the disarticulated nature of this economy. I didn't pay tribute to Samir Amin, but he was the one who used to talk a great deal about the disarticulation of economies in the South. So I think we need to begin to think about these kinds of issues and to recognize that many of the issues of the 20th century are very much alive, coming back to us in new incarnations. And we need to step up to these new challenges as we move forward. Thank you very much for your attention.